All right, let's continue with the lecture. We'll pick up where we left off here with the Jewish state. In 597 BC, Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon captured Jerusalem. You learn about that in the Old Testament class. The king and ruling class of the Jewish people were deported into exile in Babylon. Judea existed as a tributary kingdom until the Jewish king rebelled against Babylon. Nebuchadnezzar laid siege to Jerusalem and took the city in 586. The walls of the city, temple, and palace were destroyed, and the population was deported to Babylon. While the Jewish state ended, the practice of Orthodox Judaism began with these events, since those who went into captivity took with them the Old Testament writings of the law and prophets, and the worship of God continued. During the 70 years of the Babylonian captivity, the Jews began to worship in synagogues, congregations of the Jewish faithful, in which the law was taught and honored. So that was after their temple was destroyed, then the synagogues were born. In 539 BC, Cyrus of Persia captured Babylon, and the Medo-Persians became the dominant power of the Middle East. Cyrus proved benevolent, treating the people he conquered with consideration. He issued a decree to allow the Jews to return home, have the spoils of their temple returned, and have the rebuilding of their temple financed by the royal treasury. A company of the Jews returned to Jerusalem in 537. A later migration occurred under the scribe Ezra, who renewed temple services and taught knowledge of the law. Nehemiah also made the journey to Jerusalem to help rebuild the walls. He also promoted economic and social reforms. These reforms built a strong Jewish society that was loyal to the law of God, in spite of the influences of the pagan societies surrounding the returning Jewish people. Over time, the Jews and Samaritans became ethnically separated, not ethnically, but ethnically, two different racial groups. Aramaic began to replace Hebrew as the common language of Palestine, and Hellenism, or Greek culture, threatened Judaism. The three pillars of Judaism developed: the sacred, meaning Old Testament writings, the synagogue, the place where they met, and the movement of rabbinism, Jewish teachers that interpreted the sacred writings and produced later writings. So we still have those things today. Jewish teachers are known as rabbis today. The priesthood persisted as the central political power in the land. The Ptolemies controlled Palestine from 322 to 198 BC. Under them, the Jews enjoyed many privileges of a free community through their economic status, or though their economic status seems to have been poor. For the most part, the Ptolemies treated the Jews well. During this time, the Greek translation of the Old Testament, known as the Septuagint, was developed. The Seleucidae controlled Palestine from 198 to 168 BC. A ruler named Antiochus IV, also known as Epiphanes, interfered in the affairs of Palestine and sought to introduce Greek customs into Jerusalem. He plundered the temple and turned it into an altar to the Greek god Zeus. Jewish laws and religious practices were forbidden. A group of Jews led by Matthias and his sons foremost of which was Judas Maccabeus. This group revolted, known as the Maccabean Revolution. The Syrians were defeated and expelled from Jerusalem, and the Jewish temple was cleansed. This is an event celebrated during the Jewish festival of Hanukkah. Antiochus died of shock after hearing of his army's defeat. During subsequent battles, Judea temporarily gained independence. Simon, the brother of Judas Maccabeus, was made high priest for life, beginning the Hasmonean dynasty that ruled Judea from 142 to 37 BC. A treaty with Rome led to the recognition of the Jewish state's independence. However, conflict with Syria was renewed, and Simon was killed by his son in law, Ptolemy. Simon's son, John Hyrcanus, then came to power. After his death, a chaotic period ensued in which rule of Judea passed from Judah, Aristobulus, to Alexander Junius, to Aristobulus II, and finally to Hyrcanus II. Eventually, the Romans attacked Jerusalem, and Hyrcanus gave his loyalty to Julius Caesar, who recognized him as the head of the Jewish state. His minister, Antipater, appointed his sons as prefects, Phasael over Jerusalem and Herod over Galilee. During the civil wars of Rome, Herod gained the favor of the ruling party. Antigonus, a son of Aristobulus II, marched against Herod and claimed the kingship, but was defeated by the Romans and beheaded by order of Herod. The Herodian dynasty lasted from 37 BC to 6 AD, beginning with Antipater. His son, Herod the Great, inherited the throne of Judea and was inaugurated as king of the Jews, reigning from 37 to 4 BC. Herod made peace with Octavian, who became the Emperor Augustus and was confirmed in his position as king of Judea and ally of the Roman people. He conferred many benefits on the people through building public works and a renovation of the temple, yet he was never a godly Jew, as he used the priesthood as a political tool. His immoral life also made him hated by the devout men of Judaism. He also proved to be jealous and became mentally ill. His last days were filled with violence and hatred, in which he had put to death some of his own sons who had spoken or plotted against him. He died in 4 BC. He is memorialized in the New Testament for his murder of infants in Bethlehem after hearing that a new king was to be born in that location. Herod was succeeded by his son Archelaus, though conflict ensued when Archelaus's brother Antipas also made a claim to the throne. Archelaus became ruler or ethnarch of Judea, Samaria, and Idumea, while his brothers Antipas and Philip became tetrarchs. Archelaus ruled from 4 BC to 6 AD. He also had a reputation for jealousy and violent action against rivals. He was eventually banished. Philip the Tetrarch ruled over the northeast corner of Palestine from 4 BC to 34 AD. He was just and fair in his dealings with others, and he died peacefully. Antipas was tetrarch over Galilee, where Jesus lived, and Perea from 4 BC to 39 AD. He is mentioned frequently in the Gospels and was responsible for the death of John the Baptist. He was later banished by Caligula. Agrippa came to power in 37 AD, eventually ruling over much of Judea until 44. He lived in accord with the Jewish law and was one of the first persecutors of Christianity, having James killed and Peter imprisoned. His death is recorded in the book of Acts, apparently dying of severe intestinal distress. His son, Herod Agrippa II, gained the kingdom in 50. He acted as a religious advisor to the procurator Festus in his trial of Paul. He had a good knowledge of Judaism and observed its ceremonies, apparently having sincere convictions of the truth of the Jewish faith. He sided with the Romans during the Jewish revolts in 66 and later moved to Rome in 75. He died in the year 100. Various foreign rulers that dominated Palestine were generally regarded by the Jewish people as usurpers whose rule had to be tolerated, but who were never rightful rulers. They considered the priesthood to be the real controlling power. Thus, the priesthood served as the central control in Judaism until the fall of Jerusalem in 70 AD. The high priest took office by hereditary right and retained it for life. Associated with the high priest was a council of elders. The place of the high priest as leader of the nation was demonstrated in negotiating with Alexander the Great for peace. The high priesthood remained powerful and provided good government during the Ptolemaic period. When the Maccabean revolt, or with the Maccabean revolt, the older line of priests who had held office under the Seleucidae was displaced by the Hasmonean dynasty. From the Seleucidae to the Herods, the priesthood maintained its power within Judaism. The high priest acted as advisor to Roman procurators. The rule of the priests continued until the temple was destroyed and the priesthood dispersed with the fall of Jerusalem. Beginning with its conquest of Judea in 63 BC, Rome assumed a protectorate over Judea and regarded other rulers as vassal kings. Rome deposed Archelaus and appointed Coponius as prefect of Judea. Rome then ruled the country directly until its final unsuccessful revolt in 135. The governors appointed by Rome were generally not popular, and many did not maintain office for longer than a few years. The prefect Pontius Pilate, who ruled from 26 to 36, is best known for his involvement in the trial and death of Jesus. The procurators, Antonius Felix and Porcius Festus, are also mentioned in the book of Acts. There was constant tension between the Roman officials and the people. In 66, a conflict began with a series of local uprisings in various cities. Nero appointed Vespasian as commander of the Roman forces in Judea, and Vespasian proceeded to Jerusalem with an army. Vespasian conquered Judea as civil war ensued in Jerusalem under the influence of zealots. He was proclaimed emperor after Nero's death. Jerusalem fell in 70 to Titus. The temple was burned, and the citizens were massacred or sold into slavery. During the reign of Trajan, Jewish uprisings in Egypt and Cyrene were crushed relentlessly. The last element of Jewish independence was destroyed with the revolt of Bar Kokhba in 135 AD under Hadrian. Bar Kokhba was captured, Jerusalem was made a Roman city, and a temple of Jupiter was built over the site of the former Jewish temple in Jerusalem. The nation perished politically, but Judaism continued with the study of the law and observances of the faith, illustrated by the school and gymnia that began in 90 AD. We turn now to chapter 2, the social and the economic world. We'll start with the social world. The world of the first century had many commonalities with the modern world. Rich and poor, virtuous people and criminals, free men and slaves lived side by side, and the social and economic conditions were similar in many ways to the present day. Let's look at Jewish society. There was a wealthy aristocracy in both Judaism and in the pagan Roman world. Pagan is a word that refers to that Jews refer to as people that were not Jews, and then Christians came to use the same term. So, sort of people that were not either Jews or Christians, but belonged to or worshipped the traditional Greco-Roman religious gods, especially, or later on it can be applied to those worshiping other gods as well. In Judaism, it was a religious group consisting chiefly of the families of the priesthood and leading rabbis, such as the Hasmonean clan. The members of the Sanhedrin, or the Jewish High Council, were also upper class. Most of the Palestinian people, however, were poor. Social divisions among the Jews were somewhat restrained by the common obligation that the law imposed, making people morally equal in the sight of God. Look at pagan society. In the pagan world of the first century, social classes uh, were more sharply contrasted, and civil wars had disrupted the empire's social life. A new aristocracy of landholders had arisen who controlled public lands by their influence and bought cheaply the private lands of impoverished people. Largely due to the rise of slavery, the middle class was almost eliminated. Many had been killed in wars and starved out of their farms and estates, becoming homeless and dependent on the state. The plebs, or poor people, were numerous and lived in a pitiful condition, lacking steady employment and the assurance of food and clothing that even slaves had. Slaves made up a large proportion of the population of the empire. The effect of slavery was dehumanizing. Masters depended on the labor of slaves who lost all sense of morality and self respect. The institution of slavery is reflected in the New Testament, which addresses this reality without condemning or defending it. Roman society proved to be a breeding ground for crime, from the masses of unemployed people, swindlers who went to the cities to prey on society, and those who were disinherited and despairing. Romans 1 denounces and accurately describes the immorality of the pagan world that had no inherent moral standard to stop its moral decline. Let's look at cultural attainments. Under Augustus came a revival of literature in Rome, seen especially in the poet Virgil, whose epic poem, Aeneid, attempted to glorify Rome. Near the end of the first century, Pliny the Elder wrote his natural history, an attempt at a scientific account of the natural world. Historians Tacitus and Suetonius narrated the history of the Caesars, often using language that was critical. Under the emperors of the first century, Rome expanded materially, and new construction continually occurred. Numerous artistic statues were also made, generally representing persons. Music and drama were committed to the entertainment of the masses. Drama included coarse and shamelessly presented farces and mimes that dealt with the lowest kind of life. Music of all kinds was familiar, especially stringed instruments and flutes. In the amphitheater, bloody contests between men or between men and beasts were promoted by the emperor or occasionally by those who sought political office and wished to gain the favor of the crowds. Maybe you've seen movies like Gladiator that depict those contests. The chief languages of the Roman world were Latin, Greek, Aramaic, and Hebrew. Latin was the language of the law courts and the literature of Rome. It was spoken mostly in the Western Roman world. Greek was the cultural language of the empire, familiar to all educated people, and the common language of the of uh, majority of the populace from Rome eastward. Aramaic was the predominant tongue of the Near East. Classical Hebrew was a dead language, but still used by educated rabbis who made it the common language for theological thought. Such interchange of language in Palestine, where Christianity originated, brought to bear on it the influence of the civilization and literature of these languages and gave to Christianity a means for universal expression. The Romans in general were not interested primarily in mathematical and scientific pursuits. Certain fields of learning had already been explored by the time of Christ, including geometry and astronomy. Geography made great advances in the period that included the first century. Medicine also flourished in various centers around the world. The Romans' scientific work showed little originality or scientific curiosity. The Hebrews also were not particularly interested in speculative science, while Jewish and later emerging Christian religious teaching focused on the religious and ethical fields. Its revelation was not inherently opposed to science. There was no conflict between science and religion. The modern system of free compulsory education by the state for all children was unknown in the Roman Empire. Children were often trained by slaves and taught at private schools that emphasized repetition and practiced corporal punishment. The curriculum was essentially practical, based on reading, writing, arithmetic, the Greek and Latin poets, and oratory. Jewish boys received a similar pattern of education while also learning to read and write the Old Testament and learning the traditions of the fathers and the rituals of Judaism. Apparently, each municipality in the Roman Empire was responsible for its own educational program. A fair degree of literacy seems to have been attained by the people of the first century, even among the lower classes. Let's look at moral standards. The moral condition of the Roman Empire may not have been as bad as some historians have portrayed or have portrayed it. Nevertheless, all indications in the history, literature, art, and drama that have survived point to a standard of morality generally lower than our own. The early chapters of Romans, the book of the Bible of Romans, that condemn humanity as a whole, were originally directed against the empire, and the accuracy of this condemnation is supported by the sources that we have available. While comparatively decent people existed and virtue was prized, the prevailing trend in society was toward indulgence and lawlessness. Human life was cheap and murder was frequent. Divorce was accepted in society and easy to obtain. It was common to expose unwanted infants, meaning abandoning them to their deaths, While moralists advocated high ideals and spoke words of wisdom, their words made little impact on the ingrained evils of their day. They offered no spiritual precepts to change people's morality, and often they failed to practice their own moral teaching. Political corruption, debauchery, business fraud, and religious deceit and superstition made life in the Roman world depressing, if not unendurable. Let's look at the economic world. The Christians of the first century had to learn their living or earn their living in a working world. Uh, the spread and practice of their faith was affected by prevailing economic conditions. Let's look at agriculture, first of all. During the time of Christ and the early church, the Roman Empire occupied the lands surrounding the Mediterranean basin, and the coastal territories seem to have been more fertile than they are today. North Africa contained immense farms. In Italy, where large estates were almost, or where in Italy, where large estates where almost all kinds of fruits and grains could be grown. Agriculture also flourished in the western provinces of Britain, Gaul, and Germany. Let's turn to industry. Manufacturing was not as important in ancient times as it is today. Factories were small and private enterprises that employed slaves. Certain types of goods were produced in particular localities. Small villages most likely had workmen who provided for the needs of their fellow townspeople. Luxury goods were imported. Mass production of cheap goods was practically impossible. Let's turn to finance. The standard coins in the empire were the denarius and the gold aureus, or pound, worth 40 denarii. The denarius was a day's wage for a laboring man. Various kinds of money were used within the realm, and money changers had a thriving business dealing with travelers. Banking was generally practiced, and banks consisted of private companies. Money lending was a common means of enlarging one's fortune. Let's look at transportation and travel. The rule of Rome over the provinces was greatly facilitated by its excellent system of roads, which were the best the world had ever seen. The roads enabled the efficient movement of armies and commerce in every direction from Rome to the frontiers. Several of the roads were well known in ancient times. The vehicles on the roads varied according to the wealth of their owners. Some walked on foot and some rode donkeys. The higher classes could afford horses or mules, and officials traveled in light carriages. Inns, located at convenient intervals, provided meals and shelter. Most of the commercial transportation occurred by water rather than land, with good ports all around the Mediterranean Sea. The Alexandrian merchant ships were the lightest or the largest and finest of the day. Warships were lighter and faster, generally propelled by oars, pulled by galley slaves. Barges were used on the inland rivers and canals for the chief purpose of carrying cargoes of freight. Okay, this concludes the first lecture. I've given you some Bible selections as primary texts. I do that every week, or almost every week at least. So first of all, I've given you Jeremiah chapter 31, verses 31 through 34, which talks about a new covenant, which also means New Testament. And this is to emphasize uh, that something new is going to happen. Of course, this was written hundreds of years before the time of the New Testament, but it does set pace for how Christians came to understand what happened with Jesus. Or it set the tone, so that's worth taking a look at. I'll go through it slowly so you have a chance to read through it. I'm not going to read it, but I'll give you just a quick chance. You can always look this up as well. I'll just scroll through this really quick. And the next we have Galatians 4, 1 through 7, which is also talking about the fullness of time, the time that God sent his son, and that led to the new covenant. So there is that as well, both referring to this new time that has come. Now, for the attendance assignments that you need to do to get credit for attendance for this week, I've asked you this question. What is one main idea you took from this week's lecture? Please write 1 to 2 paragraphs or 1 page, up to 1 page maximum. Please don't go more than 1 page for that part, and then email that to me within the next week or so to get credit. And if you would like to do the extra credit assignment, I've asked you these 3 questions, and I've asked for 1 to 3 paragraphs. Again, don't go more than 1 page maximum. Number 1, what were the 2 kinds of government in the provinces in New Testament times? Number 2, describe some examples of the moral conditions of the Roman Empire. And number 3, in what ways can this period of history be seen as a fitting time for the beginning of the movement that would lead to the Christian church? All right, so those are the questions for attendance and extra credit this week. Please send those to me by email. If you have any other questions about the course or want copies of the notes or the syllabus, let me know and I'll send those to you. I hope you enjoyed the first lecture, and I hope you enjoy this class overall for the next 9 weeks. We'll see you next week. Take care.